In the summer of 65 CE, tragedy struck the Roman imperial palace. Poppaea Sabina, the beloved wife of Emperor Nero, died suddenly. Ancient sources disagree on the cause. Some claim illness, others whisper that Nero himself, in a fit of rage, struck her down while she was pregnant. Whatever the truth, the emperor's grief was real, and it quickly twisted into something far darker. For Nero, Poppaea was more than a consort. She embodied beauty, grace, and the image of imperial perfection. Her death left not just an empty throne beside him, but a void in his very psyche. Obsessed with her memory, he searched desperately for a way to bring her back, even if only in form. That search led him to an extraordinary and horrifying solution. In the bustling streets of Rome, Nero's eyes fell upon a young boy named Sporus. Barely in his teens, Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to the late empress. His delicate features, his youthful softness, it was enough to ignite a disturbing idea in Nero's mind. If Poppaea could not live again, then perhaps she could be remade. This moment marked the beginning of one of history's most chilling stories, the theft not only of a boy's body, but of his entire identity. Sporus was about to be stripped of his self, reshaped into an echo of the dead, and turned into a living specter of Nero's grief. Sporus was not a child of privilege. He came from obscurity, his name barely recorded before Nero's obsession fell upon him. But once chosen, his fate was sealed. The emperor commanded that the boy undergo a brutal transformation. Surgery was ordered, castration performed so that Sporus's body would remain forever smooth, his voice never deepening, his frame never hardening into manhood. This act was not only physical mutilation, but a symbolic erasure. Sporus would never be allowed to grow into himself. Instead, he would be frozen, shaped, and refashioned into an imitation of Poppaea. But the transformation did not stop with the body. Nero demanded psychological remolding. Sporus was dressed in the empress's silks, adorned with her jewels, taught to walk, to speak, even to smile as she once had. Day after day, the boy's identity was chipped away, replaced by an imposed role he could never escape. The Roman court watched in silence. Senators, generals, and courtiers saw this grotesque performance unfold and dared not oppose it. For in Rome, Nero's will was law, and to question him was to invite ruin. Instead, they played along, treating Sporus as though he truly were Poppaea reborn. Thus began the boy's descent into shadow, not living, not entirely dead, but trapped in a cruel masquerade where his very existence belonged not to himself, but to an emperor's madness. The Roman chronicles describe it in sparse, almost detached words. Yet behind those lines lies a horror that still echoes across centuries. Nero, unsatisfied with mere resemblance, commanded something unthinkable. Sporus would be physically altered, forced into the shape of Poppaea Sabina. The order was clear. Sporus was to be castrated. In Roman society, the act itself was abhorrent, a violation of both nature and manhood. It was rarely practiced, and when it was, usually upon slaves destined for menial duties. But this time it was different. This was not about punishment nor practicality. It was about obsession, about a ruler's inability to let go of the past. One can only imagine the terror of the boy. The procedure itself, primitive, excruciating, with no understanding of sterilization, was a form of torture. Roman physicians, bound to imperial command, carried it out. When the act was over, Sporus's body was no longer his own. He had been mutilated, reshaped, branded in flesh as Nero's grotesque creation. But physical change was only the beginning. Nero orchestrated a campaign of psychological transformation. Sporus was dressed in the silks and jewels once worn by Poppaea Sabina. Servants were instructed to address him as lady, to bow before him as though he were the empress resurrected. Day by day, the boy's identity was peeled away, replaced with the ghost of a dead woman. To the Roman elite, it was a spectacle equal parts fascinating and disturbing. Some whispered in horror, others laughed, treating it as a perverse entertainment. Yet none dared speak against Nero. The emperor's will was law, and his madness set the tone for the court. And so Sporus became the phantom of Poppaea, alive, but no longer truly living. The transformation was complete in body, but his torment had only begun. Once Nero had remade Sporus into the likeness of Poppaea, he staged his masterpiece of cruelty before the eyes of Rome. In a twisted mockery of marriage, Nero announced that he would take Sporus as his wife. The court was summoned. Senators, generals, and noblewomen, all who depended on the emperor's favor, were forced to watch and applaud. The ceremony unfolded with all the pomp of a royal wedding. Sporus, dressed in shimmering bridal robes once belonging to Poppaea, was veiled in purple and crowned with jewels. Nero himself played the groom, beaming as though he were reunited with his lost love. Priests invoked sacred rites as if the gods themselves sanctioned this grotesque union. The boy walked in silence, unable to refuse, unable to resist. Rome's elite looked on, trapped between revulsion and the instinct for survival. To laugh was to risk death, to weep was to risk death. The safest act was to cheer. And so they applauded, their clapping hands echoing through the marble halls, covering their own disgust. After the ceremony, Sporus became Nero's public companion. He was paraded through the streets, seated beside the emperor in his golden chariot, displayed like a trophy. Crowds whispered as they watched. Some pitied the boy, others mocked him, calling him empress in a sneer. Yet all knew that in Rome, Nero's madness was untouchable. To question it was treason. Behind palace walls, Sporus lived in constant dread. Every gesture, every word was scrutinized. He was expected not only to resemble Poppaea, but to embody her voice, her manner, even her gentleness. His own identity was erased, replaced with the mask that could never be removed. He was not Sporus anymore. He was a puppet on Nero's stage, an echo of a dead woman. But if Nero believed that this living ghost would bring him peace, he was mistaken. The emperor's paranoia deepened, his cruelty grew wilder, and Sporus, bound to him by chains both visible and invisible, was dragged further into the abyss. The marriage of Nero and Sporus might have seemed the whim of a madman, but it was more than that. It was a test. The emperor wanted to see how far Rome's elite would bend, how much humiliation they would endure before breaking. And bend they did. The senators, men who claimed to uphold the dignity of the Republic, bowed before Sporus and addressed him as Augusta, the title reserved for empresses. The generals, hardened veterans of war, saluted him as though he were Poppaea reborn. Even the priests, guardians of Rome's sacred traditions, performed rituals in his name. Not one voice in power dared to rise in protest. It was a theater of compliance, and everyone played their part. Why? Because they knew the price of dissent. Nero had executed his own mother, Agrippina, when she no longer served his needs. He had murdered his first wife, Octavia, under fabricated charges of adultery. If he could kill them, what chance did a senator or noblewoman have? The court became complicit, their silence serving as applause for the emperor's cruelty. Some, however, whispered in the shadows. The mock wedding, they said, was a blasphemy against Rome's traditions. The idea of a castrated boy paraded as an empress was both scandalous and terrifying. It symbolized how completely Nero had severed himself from reason. But whispers were dangerous in a palace where spies lingered in every corner. Sporus, meanwhile, bore the brunt of this grotesque charade. He was forced to smile when the emperor smiled, to play the role of Poppaea when called upon, and to endure mockery from courtiers who outwardly praised him. At night, behind closed doors, he was Nero's captive, subject not only to emotional torment, but to whatever whims the emperor desired. The saddest truth is that Sporus was not only a victim of Nero's madness, but of an entire system that enabled it. An empire where absolute power made cruelty a form of entertainment, and where the fear of death made accomplices of everyone. But the empire was changing, and Nero's grip on power was beginning to slip. Soon, Sporus would be dragged into the storm of conspiracies and betrayals that would consume Rome itself. By the mid-60s CE, cracks were forming in the facade of Nero's absolute rule. His excesses, the golden palace built on the ashes of Rome after the Great Fire, the endless performances where he forced the nobility to watch him sing, had bred resentment. Soldiers muttered, senators plotted, and even those closest to him began to doubt his sanity. In this climate of unrest, Sporus found himself thrust deeper into the dangerous heart of Roman politics. He was no longer just a captive in Nero's private nightmare. He was now a pawn in the empire's deadly game of survival. Wherever Nero went, Sporus was paraded by his side, a living reminder of the emperor's cruelty. To the court, he symbolized the humiliation of Rome itself. But Sporus also became something else, a mirror of Nero's vulnerability. The emperor's obsession with him revealed a desperate need for control, for love twisted into possession. Enemies of Nero took note. If they could not strike at the emperor directly, they might exploit his attachment to Sporus. Conspiracies swirled like smoke. The infamous Pisonian conspiracy of 65 CE aimed to assassinate Nero and restore the dignity of Rome. Though the plot was discovered and brutally crushed, the whispers never stopped. Some speculated that Sporus knew more than he revealed, that he was privy to Nero's deepest secrets, perhaps even to the emperor's fears. Others wondered whether he might one day betray the man who had stolen his very identity. But betrayal was a dangerous thought for Sporus. He lived in the emperor's shadow, bound by chains both visible and invisible. If Nero suspected disloyalty, death would be merciful compared to what awaited him. So Sporus endured, watching, listening, and surviving. Outside the palace walls, Rome simmered. Revolts flared in distant provinces. Generals gained armies' loyalty while Nero squandered his on vanity. And through it all, Sporus remained at his side, silent, trapped in a nightmare that was quickly spiraling toward collapse. The day would come when Nero's empire of fear would crumble, but for Sporus, the fall of an emperor would not mean freedom. It would mean being dragged once more into the theater of power, where survival required impossible choices. The year was 68 CE, and the empire trembled under the weight of rebellion. Across the provinces, governors and generals declared their defiance. Galba in Hispania, Vindix in Gaul, each rose against Nero, rallying legions weary of a ruler who treated Rome as his stage and treasury as his purse. The Senate, once his captive audience, now whispered openly of his downfall. For Sporus, the shift in power was terrifying. His life had been tethered to Nero's every breath. If the emperor fell, what would happen to the ghost bride he had fashioned from a stolen identity? Would he be killed to erase the shame? Or worse, paraded as a symbol of Nero's madness? Nero, ever desperate to maintain the illusion of divinity, clung to Sporus more tightly than ever. He staged elaborate performances, declaring that Rome would endure because the gods favored him. Sporus was forced to play his part in this theater, adorned and displayed, even as rumors spread of armies marching on the city. But reality closed in. The Praetorian Guard, Nero's own protectors, abandoned him when they realized the tide had turned. Senators declared him a public enemy. The once untouchable emperor was reduced to a hunted man. In those final hours, Nero turned to the one constant in his unraveling world, Sporus. According to Roman historians, he whispered to him with eerie tenderness, asking what sort of burial he deserved, fearing not just death, but humiliation. For Nero, Sporus was both a mirror of his lost love and the last witness to his reign. On June 9th, 68 CE, facing capture, Nero took his own life with the help of a loyal servant. His last words, trembling with irony, were said to be, "What an artist dies in me." Rome was left without its emperor, and for a brief moment, Sporus was free of the man who had remade and imprisoned him. But freedom in Rome was never simple. For Sporus, the fall of Nero did not end the nightmare. It only thrust him into the hands of new masters, each eager to exploit the symbol he had unwillingly become. With Nero gone, Rome erupted in chaos. The year of the 4 emperors had begun. A brutal carousel of power where generals, senators, and soldiers all clawed for the throne. Amid this whirlwind, Sporus became not a freed soul, but a prize. Otho, a rival to Galba and once a close companion of Nero, seized Sporus as if he were part of Nero's inheritance. The boy who had been transformed into a phantom wife was now paraded once again, this time as a living trophy of legitimacy. Otho publicly treated Sporus as his consort, reinforcing the grotesque charade Nero had begun. It was a chilling statement. If he could claim Nero's widow, then perhaps he could claim Nero's empire too. But Otho's reign was fleeting. After only 3 months, he lost to Vitellius, another contender for the throne. Sporus was dragged once more into the orbit of power, passed from one would-be emperor to the next like a possession stripped of any agency. For Vitellius, the boy's identity was not that of a spouse, but of a grotesque spectacle. Ancient sources whisper that Vitellius planned to force Sporus to play the role of Persephone in a public performance, symbolically abducted into the underworld. It was not theater, it was degradation. The plan was clear: to turn Sporus into an object of humiliation, a living metaphor for Rome's descent into chaos. For a young man already mutilated and reshaped against his will, the prospect of becoming a public mockery was unbearable. And so, standing at the edge of yet another abyss, Sporus chose death. He ended his life before Vitellius could stage his monstrous performance. His death was quiet, private, and in its own way, the first act of rebellion he had been allowed to make since Nero stole his identity. Sporus's story did not end with applause or redemption. It ended with silence, and yet his existence, twisted, tormented, erased, remained a mirror held up to Rome's darkest truths: the hunger for power, the cruelty of spectacle, and the cost of being caught in the orbit of emperors. When the dust of civil war settled and the empire found its new order, Sporus had already slipped into the shadows of history. His death left no monuments, no inscriptions, no epitaph carved into stone. And yet his presence lingered, etched not in marble, but in whispers, scandals, and the uneasy laughter of those who survived him. Roman historians, ever fascinated by the excesses of emperors, kept Sporus alive in their writings. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio did not grant him dignity, but they ensured his story endured. To them, Sporus was both a curiosity and a cautionary tale. The boy who became a ghost bride, the eunuch wife of an emperor, the unwilling symbol of Rome's decay. For many in Rome, he was a reminder of Nero's madness, the grotesque theater of power that blurred the line between private cruelty and public performance. But beneath the gossip and ridicule, there was something more chilling, a collective silence about complicity. The senators who had applauded the marriage, the courtiers who had bowed to Sporus as empress, the soldiers who enforced the charade, none of them spoke of resistance, only survival. And so Sporus became a symbol Rome could not fully confront. He was a mirror, reflecting not just Nero's cruelty, but the willingness of an entire society to play along. His story was repeated in hushed tones, not as an act of remembrance, but as a warning of what happens when power strips humanity from those beneath it. In the centuries that followed, Sporus remained a haunting footnote in the chronicles of the empire. His name survived, but his voice did not. His thoughts, his fears, his final moments, those belonged only to him, taken with him into death. What Rome remembered was not Sporus the boy, but Sporus the symbol. Centuries have passed, empires have risen and fallen, yet the story of Sporus still unsettles. It is not merely the tale of one boy's suffering, but of a society's descent into complicity. Power unchecked does not simply corrupt, it deforms, reshapes reality itself, until cruelty becomes spectacle and obedience becomes survival. Nero's obsession left behind no heir, no dynasty, only ruins and echoes. But Sporus, though he never sought it, became the most haunting testament to that emperor's reign. His mutilation, his forced identity, his coerced marriage, all serve as reminders of how fragile the human self can be when crushed under absolute power. Historians debate, was Sporus simply a victim, or did he, in his endurance, embody a form of resistance? Though he could not escape Nero's madness, he survived long enough to see the emperor fall, and later to walk Rome as a shadow among the living. Even his final act, choosing death on his own terms, can be read as a reclamation of self, a refusal to let yet another tyrant script his life. Across time, the story resonates with themes of identity, autonomy, and the human cost of treating others as objects for power's gratification. It asks unsettling questions. How far will a society go in tolerating cruelty when fear keeps its people silent? How easily can grief and obsession twist into violence when no one dares to intervene? Sporus has no statue, no tomb, no shrine, yet his ghost lingers in the chronicles, in the cultural memory of Rome, in every retelling of Nero's madness. He remains a symbol, not of weakness, but of what happens when humanity itself becomes the price of survival. And perhaps that is his truest legacy, a silent reminder that history does not only remember emperors, generals, and conquerors, it also remembers the voiceless, the broken, and the erased. For sometimes their shadows tell us more about power, cruelty, and endurance than any crown or throne ever could.